because somehow there is this notion about mutiny in an armed forces should not be a privilege. So my argument is that this was against what was an unlawful entity at that time. The British colonials were ruling India illegally. They had no business doing so. So when we rose in revolt, it was against an illegal foreign power. And therefore, this was not a mutiny against lawly elected sovereign entity. Therefore, we must see this for what it was, a patriotic freedom struggle, and not as some sort of mutiny.
In my view, the biggest misconception is that the mutiny was what is referred as just a disturbance, something which was quickly suppressed and perhaps of little consequence. Now, that simply is wrong, and it makes me wonder how misplaced the thought is. Would say that the mutiny shook the empire to its core. The true magnitude of the last of this, we often refer it as the last war, is amply found in the chilling assessment which was sent by the commander in chief, General Sir Auchinleck. It revealed the limits of the colonial control. It hastened independence, I would say, and it showed that the armed forces themselves could be agents of change.
And we need, on the 80th anniversary of the uprising, this is the year of the 80th anniversary, need to embrace it wholeheartedly and give it the recognition it deserves rather than keeping it in obscurity based on sterile debates.
Namaste and welcome. I'm Swarina Singh, and this is the Global Order. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the 1946 Naval Mutiny. The discussion is inspired by the book titled Untold Story 1946 Naval Mutiny Last War of Independence, third by G.D. Sharma, sir. For this, today we are in conversation with two distinguished naval veterans, under Vipin Sharma, sir, and Commodore Shrikant Kasnoor. Thank you so much for joining the Global Order. I would like to begin the discussion by addressing my first question to Commander Vipin Sharma. Sir, as much as it is important to talk about the book and the subject matter that it is addressing, and as we will in the later parts of our discussion, could we start by knowing something about your father, his life in the Navy, and the values he's lived by, as well as what led him to author this book and the challenges that he's faced during the publication of the same?
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to speak not just about the naval mutiny of 1946, but also about the man behind the book, my father, Lieutenant Commander G.D. Sharma. Now, this book was his mission. It was his way of saluting the sailors of 1946 mutiny. And personally, for me, it is both. It is history as well as the legacy. A bit about the career, what he had. He started his naval career in January 1948 when he joined the first batch of naval apprentice course at INS Shivaji Lonavala. He dedicated close to 4 decades of his life to the Navy before he retired in 1987. I can say that he was a doting father. He was a loyal son of the Navy. In fact, he lived Navy every single day of his life. Navy was not just a job for him, it was a calling. He carried that discipline, integrity, and loyalty right through his career and beyond. His achievements were not just merely ranks and medals. They were the respect what he earned and the trust that he inspired. Coming to the challenges that he faced, or that all of us, all encompassing, faced, I can only say the challenges were immense. Though he used to write short articles in this thing, but he embarked on this literary journey when he was approaching 80. This is a stage of life where writing a book presents its own unique challenges. Yet, I can say that with remarkable perseverance, he embraced this endeavor. His spirit was kind of indomitable. I remember him sitting with piles of notes and papers, and he was like determined to capture the truth of 1946. And small routine things become great challenges at a certain stage of life. He wasn't tech savvy. He had to struggle with things like computers, printers, but he pressed on. And because he felt very strongly that this story has to be told. After his passing in 2020, I got busy with many things on the home front before we really got started. Some time passed before I could team up with Commodore Kesnur, and we started working together in the right earnest to take on the task of editing, proofreading, preparing the manuscript, and finally its publication. Now, with Commodore Kesnor and his team on board, carried my father's, what should I say, mission forward. I wish to take this opportunity also to acknowledge the unstinted support which was extended by my friends, course mates, well wishers, and the publishers Saber and Quill. I also want to mention that this book would not have been possible without the strong support of United Services Institute, New Delhi, and the Indian Navy, of course, through Naval Headquarters, Maritime History Society, the Naval History Division, and the Directorate of Naval Veterans. The book was finally published in February 2026. Now, this was not just the release of a book, it was the completion of his unfinished duty. I can say personally, for me, it was fulfilling a promise to my father.
1946 naval mutiny involved nearly 20,000 sailors and it spread across 78 ships. Given how you shared that for Sir, it was the mission of his life that he uh, fulfilled despite many challenges on the way, and so did you and Commodore Kesnor. But regardless of the significance of the event, why is it that most Indians know so little about it and it remains on the margins of our understanding of the freedom movement? Would you agree that we've inherited a somewhat unidirectional narrative of the Indian independence struggle? And is that why Sir wanted to tell the story so strongly?
You have put a few numbers to define the scale of this mutiny. Allow me to add a few more elements that make the uprising unique. I would say to start with, the discontent was simmering in every rating, and it took the naval administration by a storm when they all came together. The naval communication systems were put to use to exchange the messages, and in no time the mutiny spread to far geographic locations. I would say that the courage displayed by the sailors to stand up against the officers was remarkable. And they knew fully well that their career and life was at stake. Now, when we look at the British response, let's say, that was more reactive because they were simply caught on the wrong foot. And among the other things, what happened, two things in my view stand out. The first is that the heads rolled in rapid succession. And the second one, perhaps, was the disproportionate use of military against, I would say, unarmed and vulnerable ratings to crush the rebellion. In my understanding, a moment of this scale has no parallels. Now let's look at the other aspect of it. If I say that on the other hand, when we look at the narratives of attaining independence, I think primarily our independence story has often been presented as something like a unified, largely non-violent, anti-colonial political movement. And it highlights campaigns like non-cooperation movement of, say, 1920-22, civil disobedience, or the 1942 Quit India movement. Now, the mutiny of 1946 clearly stands out in size and scale. Even I would say that the revolutionary approach of Shahid Bhagat Singh, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and the Azad Hind Fauj is also seen, if I may say, competing for space with the non-violent narrative. The naval mutiny of 1946 didn't quite fit into the narrative. It was perceived as messy, kind of defined. In fact, when all pieces are put together, it shows us that the freedom was not one just in legislatures, I would say, but it was the raw courage of sailors who stood up to the empire. And coming to the point of unidimensional, yes, I can say we have inherited a somewhat one dimensional view of independence because of that omission. But I must also admit here that there is a perceptible shift. The revisionists argue that the independence was achieved through a complex combination of uprisings, mass mobilization, revolutionary pressure, and Britain's post war economic exhaustion.
For the next question, I want to dive deeper and bring in Commodore Tesnor. The timing of the mutiny, sir. It breaks out in February 1946, and this is after the Second World War has left the British economy and military exhausted. Is there a reason that the mutiny happened at this particular moment? When we read about it, there's a mention of how the forces were dissatisfied with the colonizers and the administration. I think that is the right word. So was this due given the many years of the administration's presence, or is this something that became inevitable in the post World War context? Could we understand a little bit about that first?
Like with most seminal events of this nature, there's a complex interplay of circumstances. So there were certain immediate causes that arose out of day-to-day bread and butter issues, if I may, and they related to the fact that it was about bad food, it was about racist and rude behavior by the British, it was about overcrowding of sailors in fact spaces, but also it dealt with the fact that after the war, the British were now demobilizing, or in other words, reducing their force. So the Royal Indian Navy, which had gone to about 30,000 from 2,000 in a span of just few years during the war and done very well during the war, suddenly they wanted to bring it down to back to about 10,000 sailors. So you had this prospect of a lot of people losing job, losing livelihood, and the prestige that is associated with it. So that's one set of circumstances. But this was accompanied by the political uncertainty that prevailed immediately after the war, by the INA trials, which were publicized, and they hugely inspired a lot of people, including the ratings. And also remember that when they fought in the war, they fought in several theaters and they realized that they were second to none. They were as good as the Europeans or the white men when it came to performance in war. And therefore, there were expectations that the performance in war would be rewarded. But the British sort of reverted back immediately to the old, abusive or racist behavior, which then became difficult for people to take. So it was a combination of certain intra-navy, intra-service, along with the political cauldron and the feelings of nationalism. And of course, many of the sailors the main leaders among the sailors who were led were also very, very politically aware. So I think they were charged with the zeitgeist, the spirit of those times. And it was natural. There were those people who led this, the communication sailors particularly, were more well read and they didn't take to discrimination easily. Just to add a bit about the point, the question that you asked Commander Sharma earlier, yes, this has been sort of blanked out from popular narratives, and it has happened very quickly, if I can say it, for a couple of reasons. One, of course, as has been brought out, there's been a disinclination to regard revolutionaries, aggressive movements, and active movements in the freedom struggle with the same kind of reverence that the nonviolent movement had. So I think we need to relook at that aspect while acknowledging that perhaps the nonviolent movement was one of the main vectors that a lot of other movements too contributed hugely. And the second is the movement, you see, unlike INA or Netaji, it didn't have a charismatic leader or talk. So it sort of fizzled out because everyone was sent home and it seemed to be a chapter that came and went and it disappeared from the books. And there was a bit of dharam sankat, so to say, for a newly born navy, which could not embrace it at that time because mutiny is a rather sensitive world in the armed forces. So it takes some time for the armed forces to be comfortable with their growth and development, and then look back and say, "Look, this was an important aspect." So it resulted in first neglect, then ignorance, and then gradually it being removed from the popular narratives. But as Commander Sharma has pointed out, I think now people are looking afresh. And certainly the 46 naval uprising. Remember, the Navy now calls it uprising and not the mutiny. That's an important distinction. So now I think it's acknowledged to have been something that was the last nail in the coffin, the something that hugely hastened British exit. Uh, and 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 we can see why that happened subsequently.
So you've been an important part of the journey of the book. And one reflection there, I remember that back in school when we were studying about the Indian independence struggle, there was towards the end of the chapter a heading about the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny. And it was presented as something very significant, but I was surprised to see just how little of the chapter had been, uh, the space that had been allotted to the topic. It was not in as much detail as Captain Sharma also mentioned when he was speaking, as when we were taught about the non-cooperation movement or the CDM or the Quit India movement and other things. That I think makes it important then to discuss today. And like you said, that today people are beginning to appreciate it a little more. On that note, is that the uprising has altered Britain's ability to govern India. And like you said, it was the last nail in the coffin. In that regard, would you say there is something that we forget to appreciate about the mutiny in how it shook the British military's confidence, its naval power, as well as, shook the foundations of the British administration in India and stopped it from sustaining its colony in India? So something on that.
Absolutely, you are right. I think we don't appreciate it enough. And by now, there is enough historical sort of proof on that. The fact that the British immediately announced a cabinet mission for the modalities of transfer of power as the uprising happened in India is sort of proof enough of how much they were rattled by what happened. Exchange of correspondence between General Claude, like who was the CNC of India, and indeed Lord Wavell to the India office in London, clearly says that we can no longer hold on to India. At best, it is on a day to day basis. And the reason is we can no longer take the loyalty of the Indian armed forces for granted. So please remember that colonial power stays in another country only because of the coercive elements that it has, which include the armed forces a great deal. The moment the armed forces turn against you, then the coercive power is no longer with you. So the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny or uprising, it immediately sparked off similar such protests in the Royal Indian Air Force, in certain Indian Army contingents, so it started to spread. And even during the uprising, you had the Indian soldiers refusing to fire on the mutineers, and the British soldiers had to be brought in. You had the Indian Air Force, sort of planes not taking off. It became very clear that they didn't want to take action against these people. So Britain had to summon forces from Trincomalee. They had to summon the Royal Navy. They had to get the artillery and armor, the tanks and guns. I mean, this disproportionate response that Commander Sharma talked about was clearly because they panicked and they rattled. So once your hold over the country is no longer tenable, then you are convinced that I cannot stay. And I think the finest, sort of, the most apt evidence in this regard is offered by Clement Attlee himself 10 years after independence during a visit to Calcutta in 1956. He speaks to Justice Chakravarti, the Chief Justice of Calcutta High Court, and then the acting governor of West Bengal. And then he mentions to Justice Chakravarti that it was the INA trials and the RIM mutiny that made them leave in a hurry. And he adds specifically that the Quit India movement had minimal effect. He may have reasons to disparage Mahatma Gandhi or whatever, but
the way he foregrounds the INA trials and the RIN mutiny is very, very important. So I think we now need to acknowledge that this uprising was indeed in some ways the last war of independence, and increasingly evidence points to that, and therefore we must commemorate and celebrate this.
Do want to bring back Captain Sharma into the discussion. Now, Commodore Kasnoor has made a very important point about the loyalty of the forces. And adding on to that, what I want to ask you is that, you know, historians say that it is one thing to have military strength, but in order to be able to sustain that and hold on to that, it is important to have the loyalty of the forces in place. And Sir has spoken about how this led to unrest in the Air Force as well as the Army. So the loyalty of the armed forces combined is something that is of great significance. Now, when we speak about the 1946 uprising, would you like to add on to the point that has been made that this was the time when Britain realized that it could no longer rely on the loyalty? And was this a sudden realization, or would you say that this had been in the making for quite a while before it led to the uprising in 1946?
My pat answer for this is absolutely. It was the breaking point. Has survive because their soldiers and sailors obey. The moment that snaps, everything crumbles. February 1946 showed that the obedience could no longer be guaranteed. There is umpteen number of messages which were exchanged between Delhi and London, and there is enough evidence to say that things were not fully under the control of the British Empire. Yes, discontent had been brewing, but this was the rupture. Britain saw, in stark terms, I would say, that the loyalty of Indian forces was not assured. And once the loyalty cracked, the empire's foundations crumbled. It is just perhaps as simple as that.
I did have a question, either of you who wants to take it up, about the coordination during the uprising. Now, communication today is quite smooth, but at that time in 1946, when an uprising was taking place, I want to know a little bit about the coordination and communication that might have gone into it, as well as when we talk about coordination. I also want to know something about the solidarity of the soldiers that one would have witnessed during the uprising. Given that India is a diverse country, has always been, the soldiers came from different religious, linguistic, cultural backgrounds. One thing that I want to know again is about the coordination and communication, and another is at the later end of the question, if you could answer, as to what does this say about the emergence or the evolution of a shared national consciousness amongst the armed forces.
I think you're right about the way the communications was very, very cleverly used. I would think, as you brought out today, we use social media the same way. Now, this began as a spark in HMIS Talwar. Talwar was the Navy's communication school, so it also had wireless equipment, and very quickly the sailors seized those equipment and transmitted messages, and that went indeed all over the entire empire from, say, Karachi to Kolkata, and they were able to communicate through that. So that was very smart. And communication sailors at that time have been considered the smarter, the better, the more well-read ones. And so they were, I think, very, very good. Mind you, they also captured the Butcher Island, which is the ammunition depot in Bombay, as well as the ship's armory. So they were smart enough to make sure that they capture the vital important compartments in the ship. They locked up the British officers and kept them there. And they brought down the British flag and the ensign and raised flags that were a combination of the Congress, the Muslim League, and in some cases the communists. So all in all, I think they showed not just nationalistic fervor, they showed smart moves, and they pointed the gun ammunition at the Royal Bombay Yacht Club, the Gateway of India, and buildings and places seen as some sort of symbols of imperialism, so to say. So that extent, they were very, very smart. And I would say that a lot of these leaders indeed were people who, I mean, you wouldn't think that a 20-year-old, 22-year-old rating would think that way. All of these people, we see that Madan Singh, MS Khan, so they were maybe much beyond their years in the way they thought. They were very, very politically aware and enlightened. Now, whether this resulted in a national consciousness, I would say yes. I do remember, as you yourself told, armed forces represent a microcosm of the country. And to that extent, even before independence, they came from all parts of India, and there was a sort of melding that they did. But moment you mix that with nationalistic fervor that happened during this movement and in the run up to it, then you start to get a sense of national identity. And remember that that came to the fore when they fought during the World War II. They would have certainly thought, look, what am I fighting for? Why am I doing this? And while there are correspondents of the army soldiers who are out there in the front lines and trenches and not so much about naval sailors, it would be natural to assume that they were thinking of all these issues. So when independence came, it came on the back of this fantastic performance in World War II, as well as the naval uprising. So now you had to temper all this and build a new navy. And I think the nationalistic fervor that dominated, the cosmopolitan spirit that was a part of it, all that came together. And remember that a lot of young Indian leadership saw the uprising and they realized immediately what are the mistakes that must not be done. So you need a more gentle, a more benign, a more grounded and humble leadership as you take over the reins of the Navy. And that is what the Navy's post independence leadership did. If you see most of the accounts of these leaders, they reflect on the mutiny or the uprising and say, look, that was a dreadful moment, and we must not let that happen in independent India. So it gave a template for leadership and it forged a new national consciousness.
A couple of points taking forward from what Commodore Castor had said. There was one more thing what I really liked about this thing, and I really appreciate that they were all junior ratings. Let's understand that first. And when they had put those graffitis, that was a smart move, according, because it these were minor pinpricks, which were kind of frustrating the British administration. Putting up graffiti, hoisting some bucket, and that kind of a thing in the mast. And even one more thing, what stands out is that uh, when the commanding officer is coming for rounds, or he's coming and trying to talk to them, they were little kind of passing some snide remarks in whispers. And we must remember that they were not allowed to be grouping together. In fact, they were just kind of on the spur of the moment thought of things, but they were the kind of pinpricks which mattered a lot. And coming to the solidarity part of it, this was the moment where sailors from every region, every religion, and every language stood together, and they didn't rise as fragmented communities. They rose as one national force. Now, that unity tells us something profound. By then, I would say that it had become a shared national consciousness, and it had taken roots in the armed forces. I would say that they saw themselves not just as sailors of the Royal Indian Navy, but as Indians fighting for dignity. That solidarity was the spirit of freedom itself.
So while you are speaking, I would like you to start with addressing the final question as well, and Commodore Kesnoor sir can add on to it after that. As distinguished naval veterans who have an insider view on the uprising, for the 1946 naval uprising, if there was one misconception that you wish that historians, students, the wider public at large should reconsider and maybe re-engage with, what would that be and why?
In my view, the biggest misconception is that the mutiny was what is referred as just a disturbance, something which was quickly suppressed and perhaps of little consequence. Now, that simply is wrong, and it makes me wonder how misplaced the thought is. Would say that the mutiny shook the empire to its core. The the true magnitude of the last of this, we often refer it as the last war, is is amply found in the chilling assessment which was sent by the commander in chief, General Sir Auchinleck. It revealed the limits of the colonial control. It hastened independence, I would say, and it showed that the armed forces themselves could be agents of change. The naval mutiny of 1946 was definitely a turning point, I would say. When we talk about the naval mutiny of 1946, we are not just talking about history. We are talking about the courage, about the unity, and the breaking of the empire's backbone, if I may say. And for me personally, we are also talking about my father's final salute to the Navy he loved. The book is his voice, his gift, I would say, and his legacy, of course. And today, it stands as a reminder that the freedom was won in many ways, through words, through marches, and yes, through mutiny.
Just to add to what Commander Sharma has said, uh, I will begin with a small statistic. You know that in Bombay alone, and I'm not talking of the mutineers from the Navy, but citizens of Mumbai who joined in support of the uprising on 22nd of February, if I remember right, and the authorities came heavily on them. uh, 400 to 500 people died in the high-handed response of the authorities, and more than 1,500 people were injured. This is about the same numbers as Jallianwala Bagh. We remember Jallianwala Bagh as we must, but we have forgotten the naval uprising. And therefore, I believe very, very passionately that this naval uprising, which became a national uprising, ought to be remembered for the remarkable way it hastened freedom, and for the remarkable way it played out in many ways. To me, the people who took part were courageous, they were audacious, they were patriotic. So, the misconception I want cleared and for which I have been campaigning for long is that a lot of people, even those who acknowledge this, are somewhat diffident or shy about embracing it fully, because somehow there is this notion about mutiny in an armed forces should not be privileged. My argument is that this was against what was an unlawful entity at that time. The British colonials were ruling India illegally. They had no business doing so. And when we rose in revolt, indeed, in most countries, it's actually through the armed forces revolt or revolutions that freedom is achieved. So when we rose in revolt, it was against an illegal foreign power, and therefore this was not a mutiny against lawfully elected sovereign entity. Therefore, we must see this for what it was, a patriotic freedom struggle, and not as some sort of mutiny. And we need, on the 80th anniversary of the uprising, this is the year of the 80th anniversary, need to embrace it wholeheartedly and give it the recognition it deserves rather than keeping it in obscurity based on sterile debates.
My take back from the conversation, I think, like you shared, that this was not a mutiny as we know it, but an uprising as it has been called now, which is proof of how the armed forces came together in support of the civilians, in interest of the civilians, against a foreign colonizer, the British administration in India. So one must remember it from that perspective. And like Captain Sharma also pointed out in the beginning, that we may give it some numbers such as 20,000 sailors or 78 ships, but it must not be limited to that. This is an event that needs to be looked at with equal importance as we do when we for other events when we're studying the independence struggle or the movement in India. And To take a deeper, more detailed, insightful dive into it, we have the book that we discussed today, The Untold Story, 1946 Naval Mutiny, The Last War of Independence. Ironically, there is a lot of discussion about the First War of Independence. And it's time, like the both of you shared, that we bring into the mainstream a discussion about the last war of independence, which was indeed the last nail in the coffin of the British administration in India. Our deepest gratitude to G.D. Sharma sir for presenting it to us in a concise and comprehensive book, as well as to Captain Vipin Sharma and Commodore Shrikant Kasnoor sir for being present with the Global Order today. Thank you so much for being here.